All right, our third panelist is Oliver Cussen, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. His dissertation, Experiments in Empire, the Global Civil Society of Old Regime France, examines the development of commercial imperialism in the 18th century through a series of case studies on colonial commodities. And his paper today is entitled Michel Adanson and the Gum Trade, an Imperial Meridian for Old Regime France.
Thank you, and thank you also to the organizers of the conference and the panel and their great papers. Okay, so in 1763, after the 7 Years' War, the Duc de Choiseul asked the precocious botanist, Michel Adanson, for advice on how to find value in France's remaining Atlantic possessions outside of the Antilles. Adanson had recently spent 5 years in Senegal at the pleasure of the Compagnie des Indes, where he learned about the global dynamics of conquest and commerce. This experience informed his response to Choiseul, in which he presented a remarkable theory of botany and war, a deep history of the jealousy of plants. Adrian had destroyed Jerusalem, he claimed, so he could possess cedar. Xerxes invaded Athens and Cato Carthage for figs. How many troubles has the date tree stirred up in the Levant? And in our times, hasn't nutmeg caused the Dutch to take up arms in the Indies? Is mahogany not the subject of war between the diverse nations in Brazil, he asked. And the 7 Years' War, Adanson told Choiseul, was fought over gum. A vital component in the manufacturing of textiles, true gum could only be procured from the Senegal River Valley, where it was exchanged for Indian cloths, American rum, and European guns. The French had enjoyed a nominal monopoly on the European provision of gum for the previous 5 decades, but in reality had very little control of the trade, which was subject to a variety of ecological, political, and commercial factors internal to Senegambia. In any case, the British had, in 1758, driven the French out of Saint Louis, the main trading establishment in the region. Adanson, however, claimed exclusive knowledge of the true qualities of the precious commodity, knowledge that he had picked up while herborizing during an otherwise miserable time in Senegal. And these are some of the maps that he drew in Senegal and sketched out. Gorée is down here and Saint Louis is at the mouth of the river valley. It kind of looks like a civilization computer game, which is maybe appropriate. He proposed to Choiseul a spectacular Columbian exchange. Ile Gorée, France's remaining toehold on the West African coast, would serve as a nursery, a pépinière, from which seeds, saplings, and plants, tools, people, and animals would be sent to Cayenne. A fledgling colony would therefore gain, as if overnight, resources for agriculture, medicine, transport, and artillery. But most crucially, it would get gum. Adanson's project never happened, and this is a talk about it. More accurately, it is about how Adanson's understanding of nature and empire was consistent with more general tendencies in French commercial imperialism after the 7 Years' War. Acacia trees remained in the Senegal River Valley, resisting the abstract logic of one of the 18th century's more ambitious botanists. But from the perspective of French colonial administration, Gorée and Cayenne were institutionally entwined, and their fates were held together by gum. Part of my goal in this talk, then, is to show what we can learn about 18th century commercial imperialism when we look closely at particular commodities. And in this case, I think we learn 2 things. Firstly, we learn that the economy of France's overseas empire, like its domestic economy, was fragmented. Each market had its own geography. The gum market was no exception, encompassing Senegalese comptoirs, French Atlantic ports, Parisian banks, and, surprisingly, settlements in Guyana. And secondly, we learn that commodity markets were not just about profits. They reveal attitudes about commerce and colonialism that might not otherwise be apparent. What were the French looking for after 1763? How did they respond to the crisis of the 7 Years' War? We find interesting answers to these questions if we look for them in gum. This is Delille, a more sort of reliable map from the same period from 1750 of Senegal River and French establishments there. Adanson's plan was rejected in favor of the infamous Kourou expedition, a no less ambitious colonization project for Guyana. But as I will show at the end of this talk, the assumptions behind his plan resonated even after that disastrous failure. So what were those assumptions? Primarily, they were environmental. Ile Gorée and Cayenne, he thought, were situated on roughly the same latitude, two Atlantic terminals along what Adanson mysteriously referred to as the torrid zone of the boreal hemisphere. Adanson had never been to Guyana, but based on what he had read, he believed that its climate was analogous to that of Senegambia, enough so to facilitate a hellacious transfer of natural resources between the two regions. All told, 41 species of plant would be sent across the Atlantic, along with cows, goats, elephants, camels, and, of course, people. Guyana would become the new Senegal. But the main objective of this transatlantic transfer was to finally cultivate gum within the French colony. Throughout his proposal, Adanson displayed a keen knowledge of the gum market. He knew the extent of European consumption, the prices during peace and war. In a good year, he calculated, the trade would be worth up to 22.4 million livres noirs. He worked out that within 15 years, 20 at most, 2 1-league squared plantations of acacia trees would produce more gum than the whole of Senegal, and more than enough for the entire European manufacturing industry. This is not Adanson's sketch, but it is a sketch of a kind of agronomic plan for clearing the land and draining the swamps in Guyana. This is from 1774. It shows kind of canals and irrigation and all the various ways you could master nature. Is there anywhere in the known world, Adanson asked, an object of commerce that can compare to that? This was the crux of Adanson's pitch to Choiseul. If his plan succeeded, France would have scant cause to regret its African losses during the 7 Years' War. It was possible to transplant to the new colony of Cayenne the most precious commerce that is undertaken in Senegal, surpassing even the slave trade. Extensive knowledge in natural history and botany had helped him discover the analogy between the two regions, convinced him that acacia trees would take root in Guyana, and allowed him to speculate on the subsequent commodification and market behavior of gum. There is then, in Adanson's proposal, evidence of the by now familiar relationship between methods of natural history and the emergent ideology of laissez-faire economics. Foucault, who famously argued that natural history and political economy operated according to the same logic of mimesis, presents Adanson as a naturalist who took the classificatory spirit to extremes, as someone who thought that botany could be approached in the same manner as geometry or algebra. But natural history was also a science of order in the domain of beings, and Adanson did not shy away from recognizing the broader biopolitical implications of his expertise. In other words, the political economy of Adanson's proposal went beyond an argument for how to make nature commercial. It also incorporated an argument for the wholesale reform of colonial governance. New value could only be squeezed out of France's remaining colonial possessions by the improvement of both their human and natural resources. Consider his account of the disorder in French establishments in Senegal, where he condemned the influence that mulâtresse and négresse exercised over the French, who have always had a certain affection for a sex as dangerous as it is attractive. In Gorée, powerful signaras would control access to local commercial networks, would own huge retinues of domestic slaves, and would receive privileges from marriages to French company employees à la façon du pays. Adanson hated this. Like French slavers who traded there, he saw this matriarchal culture as a waste of productivity. He conceded that there are in Senegal some négresses who, despite their color, deserve to be admired. But in terms of the health of the colony as an organism, the signaras and their domestic slaves were bloodsuckers. In contrast, the colony he envisaged in Guyana was to be industrious and virtuous. Since returning from Senegal, Adanson had embraced the new science of agronomy. He corresponded with Duhamel de Monceau and experimented with wheat varieties around Paris. These are some of his sketches of his experiments. You can't really read what he says. I mean, you can't really read it anyway, but this is kind of where he's doing his experiments, at least. Adanson's main source on the natural history of Guyana was a pamphlet by a resident, Brultou de Préfontaine, titled Maison Rustique, an obvious nod to Charles Etienne and Jean Liébeault's original Maison Rustique from 1572, one of the foundational texts on French agriculture that agronomists were republishing and promoting at the time. Préfontaine's Maison Rustique was a manual for colonists of Guyana, mixing instructions on colonial agriculture with appeals to plantation owners and slaves alike on the Christian virtues of labor. This is Préfontaine's plan for his plantation. all very rational and organized, also including a chapel. And this is also, he had all these etchings and engravings in this pamphlet, and this is how to build a scaffold to cut down the trees in Guyana. As Michel Duché has shown in great detail, Guyana was the site par excellence for improving naturalists interested in civilizing nature and people through agrarian labor. So it's perhaps no surprise that Adanson invested hope in Guyana. It promised the perfect antidote to French impotence in West Africa. Like many European colonial elites then, Adanson saw a direct correlation between the progress of a given society and its knowledge of and ability to cultivate nature. He believed that civilizational benefits would result from the Atlantic transfer of acacia if it was supervised correctly. He cautioned that the peopling of Cayenne ought to be commensurate with both the progress of the acacia forests and the colony's primary necessities. The colonists would ideally be laborers, gardeners, fishermen, no older than middle-aged, if possible from the Languedoc and Provence, and so accustomed to hot climates. In short, Adanson's proposal was a detailed and systematic case for rebuilding French commerce in the boreal hemisphere, around a drastically altered gum trade. But it also betrayed the ascendant fashions in colonial political economy, natural history and agronomy, the elite sciences of the High Enlightenment, a focus on the economic utility of botany and the virtues of agrarianism, an emphasis on the organization of land and the disciplining of labor, and a fascination with logics of civilization and racial hierarchy. I want to move towards a conclusion by suggesting then that in Adanson's eccentric proposal, we can see the emergence of something akin to an imperial meridian of old regime France. The post-1763 period, so often presented as one of liberal reform, was not defined by the immaculate apotheosis of commercial society, but rather, at least in part, by the anxious insistence on hierarchy and an agrarian virtue in the colonies. And in the metropole, the social interests that financed and governed the gum trade were not bourgeois merchants, but Parisian aristocrats. And so in France after 1763, just as in Britain, we see the embrace of a kind of gentlemanly capitalism in imperialism. So I want to just finish up with a quick sketch of this story. After the Compagnie des Indes folded in 1769, a series of companies asserted control over the gum trade, and in doing so solidified the putative relationship between Senegal and Guyana. This began modestly enough through a combination of commercial networks that had been based in Senegal, along with Choiseul's enduring faith that Guyana could become the new New England. This venture was soon consolidated in the Compagnie de la Guyane, with a capital of 1.2 million livres funded by the traditional nobility. As Cussen and Nogaret says, not a single merchant. The company's colonization effort in South America was based on the labor of Senegalese slaves and the profits of Senegalese gum. It was this company that in 1779 took the lead in capturing Ile Saint-Louis back from the British after the Treaty of Paris, it was compensated by the government with a monopoly on the now booming gum trade and changed its name to the Compagnie de la Gomme du Sénégal, now with a capital of over 3 million livres and the same exalted shareholders. There remained, in other words, an institutional nexus in Adanson's boreal hemisphere between Guyana and Senegal. These companies were at the forefront of a gentlemanly capitalism in old regime France, what Chris Bailey and before him Kanan Hopkins called the successful oligarchy of land and commerce. Why did aristocrats attach themselves to this area of France's commercial empire? Perhaps they found something salutary in the idea of improving a land and its people through cultivation and agrarian virtue. Such attitudes were indeed present in Guyana. In 1790, a deputy of the Colonial Assembly penned L'Agricole Cayenois, a long tract heavily influenced by Buffon's Histoire naturelle, in defense of both slavery and colony building as a divine obligation to civilize both nature and people. It is possible then that there was some natural affinity between gentlemanly capitalism and the colonial ideology of civilization. This was an imperialism of high finance, high culture, and high farming. Or perhaps the answer is to be found a little more cynically on the other side of the Atlantic. Gum was a stubbornly monopolistic commodity. If its supply could be secured, so could its profits. And on the eve of the revolution, the gum company was posting generous returns from the trade of both gum and slaves. Either way, there was in the gum trade a compatibility between merchant capital and the hierarchies of and ideologies of the old regime. In many ways, this outlasted the old regime itself and provided an infrastructure for the turn to empire in the 19th century. The French would remain in Senegal even after the abolition of the slave trade, capable of exploiting an ongoing boom in the gum trade as European textiles production industrialized. And Guyana, of course, would go on to witness the reimposition of slavery and the establishment of a penal colony. In the colonies, at least, we can see the persistence of the old regime, and with it, some of Adanson's ideas about nature and empire.